The first sound wasn't metal. It wasn't the screech of steel twisting against itself or the loud slam that followed. It was silence. That kind of silence that makes your stomach tighten before the world reminds you why. I remember standing there, staring at my car, a car I had waited for, saved for, celebrated when I finally brought it home just 2 months ago, and then watching the heavy garage shutter lying crooked, its weight pressed against the front hood like an accusation. No words came out of my mouth, just that still silence, stretching across the dimly lit condo parking garage, echoing louder than any crash could. I kept looking at the front of my car, at the scratches and dents carved into the paint that had still smelled new every time I drove it. It didn't feel real. The shutter wasn't supposed to fall. These things are bolted, inspected, trusted, aren't they? But there it was, a piece of the building itself failing, and my car paying the price. I didn't touch it right away. Instead, I just stared, almost afraid that if I moved closer, the damage would somehow deepen, like an open wound that stings worse when you press it. There's a moment after something breaks when you realize it's not just the object that's damaged, it's your sense of safety. Every time I had parked in that garage, I trusted the walls, the doors, the shutter to protect what I left behind. That shutter wasn't just metal. It was supposed to be security, a boundary between the world outside and the life I lived inside my condo. But now, lying flat against my new car, it looked less like protection and more like betrayal. I pulled out my phone and took photos, each click of the camera making the reality harder to deny. The angle of the shutter, the crushed paint, the way the garage lights cast long shadows over the scene, like the building itself wanted to hide what had happened. Every picture felt like evidence, not just proof of damage, but proof of a failure that shouldn't have happened. Reporting it to the property manager felt mechanical, almost like filing a form after an accident you don't want to admit to yourself. I sent the photos, explained what happened, and waited. But waiting doesn't make the questions stop. Who pays for this? Is this on me, the unlucky owner of a car parked in the wrong spot at the wrong time? Or is it on them, the HOA, the board, the insurance that exists for situations exactly like this? When I sent the photos to the property manager, I expected a call back that same evening. Some acknowledgement, some apology, something human. Instead, the reply came in the form of a short, flat email. We have received your report. The board will review the matter. Please contact your auto insurance in the meantime. The words felt colder than the shutter itself. No sorry, no concern. Just a gentle push, a nudge in the direction that would keep them safe and me stuck with the mess. It triggered a memory I hadn't thought about in years. I was 12 when the ceiling of my childhood bedroom started to leak. Not a gentle drip, but a steady stream that stained the walls and warped the wood. My father had gone to the landlord, showing photos, even bringing him into the room. The landlord had smiled, polite but detached, and said, "That's why you have renter's insurance." I still remember my dad's silence afterward, the way his jaw tightened as if he'd swallowed every word he wanted to spit out. That night we slept with buckets on the floor and the landlord's smile still echoing in our heads. Now, standing in that garage decades later, it felt like the same script, just different actors. The HOA board wasn't a landlord, but they carried the same detachment. They existed in a space where responsibility was more about paperwork than people. And maybe that's what hurt the most, the realization that to them, my new car wasn't a dream, wasn't a milestone, wasn't even personal. It was just an item on an agenda, something to be minimized, deflected, filed away. I called the property manager instead of replying to the email. My voice was calm at first, explaining again what happened, how the shutter was a common facility, how their master insurance should step in. The manager listened quietly, but when she spoke, it was the same line. You should reach out to your auto insurance. That's the fastest way to resolve it. But it's not my responsibility, I said, feeling my chest tighten. This is on the HOA. This is your equipment that failed. There was a pause, a long one. Then her voice softened, almost like she wanted to sound understanding. I know it's frustrating. I'll forward your complaint to the board, but I can't promise the outcome. That contradiction burned. Her tone was gentle, even sympathetic, but the meaning was clear. She was there to protect them, not me. And in that moment, I realized sympathy without accountability is just another form of dismissal. Over the next week, the silence grew heavier. No updates, no responses. Just my car sitting in the garage, still dented, still carrying the scar of their negligence. Neighbors walked by, some stopping to ask what happened. I told them. And then the stories started trickling out. One neighbor mentioned how last year the elevator broke down for 2 weeks, stranding an elderly resident on her floor. The HOA's response? Use the stairs. Another talked about a leaking pipe that flooded a storage room, damaging boxes of family photos and heirlooms. The board's reaction? That's why you have personal insurance. The pattern was clear. Every problem was handed back to the residents, as if the HOA existed not to protect us but to shield itself. The more I listened, the more I felt that weight of betrayal. We weren't just paying fees for maintenance, we were paying into a system that seemed designed to avoid responsibility at all costs. And yet, there was a strange unity in those conversations. My neighbors weren't surprised. They shrugged, almost resigned, as though they'd already made peace with the idea that justice here was optional. I wasn't ready to shrug. I started gathering documents. The HOA's bylaws, the insurance policy, the maintenance records, anything that could show that the shutter was their duty, not mine. Late at night, my living room looked more like a lawyer's office than a home. Papers spread across the table, sticky notes with dates and terms, screenshots of emails. Each piece felt like a weapon, not against a person, but against a wall of indifference. But collecting evidence didn't quiet the tension. It stirred it. Because every time I flipped through those papers, I saw the cracks, not just in the shutter, but in the system itself. And behind those cracks, there was something uglier. People on the board who knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't incompetent. They were deliberate. One evening, I overheard 2 board members talking in the lobby. They didn't see me at first. Their voices were low but clear enough. If we admit fault, everyone will start bringing claims. The budget can't handle it. The other laughed softly. That's what personal insurance is for. Let them. Deal with it. They finally noticed me as I passed. One of them smiled, that same polite, hollow smile I'd seen years ago with my father's landlord. In that smile was the truth. They weren't protecting the community. They were protecting the board, the money, the fragile balance that kept them in control. I walked back to my car, staring at the dented hood again, and the silence from the letter lay on my kitchen table for hours, untouched except for the crease I had left in the paper when my hand clenched too hard. I kept glancing at it while I moved around the apartment, pretending to busy myself with little things. Making tea, wiping the counter, rearranging mail that didn't matter. But the truth was, every sound in the room seemed quieter because of that letter. It wasn't just words anymore. It was a threat. A reminder that the fight I thought was about a shutter and a car had already twisted into something darker. I tried to reason with myself, whispering the lines in my head like a prayer. Maybe it was a bluff. Maybe someone on the board was just trying to scare me. Maybe if I stopped pushing, life would go back to normal. But each time I told myself that, the image of the shutter falling replayed. Metal slamming against metal, the dent spreading across the hood of my new car like a wound. It wasn't just the damage. It was the feeling of betrayal, the way silence filled the garage before I even had the words to react. That silence was still inside me. And now it had been joined by this, a voice I couldn't see, telling me to give up. Doubt crept in anyway. Was I really doing the right thing? What if I was making it bigger than it needed to be? I could file a claim with my auto insurance, pay the deductible, and move on. It would be easier, quieter, maybe safer. But that would mean swallowing the same indifference I had seen in my father years ago, when the landlord ignored the leak. I remembered how that silence changed him, how he grew tired, smaller in some way, as if each ignored injustice carved away a little more of who he was. I had promised myself I wouldn't live like that, and yet here I was, debating whether to fold just to protect myself from more discomfort. The breaking point didn't come in a flash of anger. It came in the middle of the night, when I woke from a dream that wasn't really a dream but a memory disguised. In it, I was back in the garage, standing in front of the car. Only this time, I wasn't alone. A little boy stood beside me, 10, maybe 11, holding my hand. His face wasn't clear, but I knew it was me, younger, the version that watched his father's silence years ago. He looked up at me and whispered, "Are you going to stay quiet too?" And before I could answer, the shutter began to fall again, heavy and slow, right above him. That's when I woke, drenched in sweat, my chest tight as if the weight of that shutter had pressed against me in real life. Sleep never came back after that. Instead, I sat at the table staring at the letter, feeling the decision build in me, like a storm. Fear told me to let it go. Anger told me to fight. But somewhere in the middle was guilt, the voice asking if I was doing this for justice or just for myself. Was I trying to hold the HOA accountable for everyone's sake, or was I clinging to my own pride, refusing to accept loss? The line blurred more with every passing hour. The next morning, I made my choice. Though I wasn't sure if it was courage or recklessness, I decided to bring it to the community. If the board wanted me silent, I would be louder. If they wanted me isolated, I would find others. Maybe that was the risky decision, maybe even dangerous, but it felt like the only way forward. That's when I met Clara. She lived 2 floors above me, a retired teacher with a voice that carried even when she wasn't trying. I had seen her before, always moving briskly through the halls, her eyes sharp in a way that made you straighten your back when she looked at you. When I told her what happened, she didn't look surprised. She invited me into her unit, poured coffee, and listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back, her eyes narrowing. "They sent you a letter?" I nodded. She laughed, though there was no humor in it. "You're not the first. When the pipe burst last year and flooded my storage, I got the same kind of warning. Different words, same message. Stay quiet. Don't stir the water. They like people who pay dues and keep their heads down. You don't fit that mold." Her words should have comforted me, but they carried a challenge instead. Because if I wasn't the first, why hadn't I heard more about it? Why had the stories from neighbors always come with shrugs like they were resigned to defeat? Maybe Clara was different. Or maybe she was proof that resistance was lonely, that those who spoke up were pushed to the margins. "What did you do?" I asked. "I let it go," she admitted, her voice low now. "I had family photos ruined, things I can never replace, and I still let it go, because fighting them takes more out of you than you think. They drag it out, twist your words, make you look like the problem. And in the end, you start wondering if the damage to your peace of mind is worse than the damage they caused in the first place." That contradiction cut through me. Clara was warning me, trying to protect me from the path she had chosen not to walk. And yet, in the way her voice broke for just a moment, I heard the regret. Maybe she had let it go, but it hadn't let go of her. We sat in silence, the kind that felt heavier than words. I realized then that Clara was both a mirror and a warning. Proof of what I could become if I backed down, and proof of what it might cost if I didn't. I walked back to my unit that afternoon with more weight on my shoulders than before. The letter was still there on the table, waiting like an unanswered question. But now, Clara's story had joined mine. Her regret whispered alongside my fear, and together they pushed me closer to the edge of decision. That night, I drafted an email to the board. I didn't send it right away, but the words stared back at me from the screen. Direct, detailed, unflinching. I laid out the facts, the responsibility, the risk of ignoring the hazard. I even mentioned that neighbors were aware, that silence wouldn't last forever. My finger hovered over the send button, my heart pounding. The knock wasn't loud, but in the silence of the apartment, it carried like a gunshot. 3 short raps against the wood, steady, deliberate. I froze where I stood, still holding the phone in one hand and staring at the glowing message on the screen. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't even think. Just the sound of my own pulse in my ears, rushing like water. Another knock came, slower this time, as if whoever stood outside knew I was there and wasn't planning on leaving. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the door with small, hesitant steps. I didn't touch the knob. Instead, I pressed my eye to the peephole. Clara. She was standing there in her heavy coat, clutching something in her hand. Papers, maybe. Relief rushed through me so hard I had to grip the doorknob. To steady myself, I opened the door, trying to mask the fear in my voice. "You shouldn't sneak up on people like that," I whispered, though it came out harsher than I meant. She looked at me, her brow furrowed. "I knocked 3 times. I figured you'd hear it." She stepped inside before I could stop her, brushing past me and placing the papers on my table. "I thought you should see this." The papers were copies of maintenance reports, old ones, all marked completed in neat handwriting. Clara leaned closer, her voice dropping to a low murmur. "Half of these repairs were never done. They sign off, but nothing changes. That shutter you're fighting over, it was listed for inspection last year. They wrote it up as cleared, but nobody ever touched it." Her words cut deeper than the dent in my car. The HOA hadn't just failed to act. They'd covered their failure with paperwork. That meant the shutter falling wasn't an accident. It was negligence dressed up as order. A lie. I slumped into a chair, staring at the stack of reports, each one heavier than the last. Clara's eyes followed me, sharp but tired. "Do you understand what this means?" she asked. "Yeah," I muttered. "It means I was right. It also means," she said, her voice firmer now, "that they won't let this go. If this gets out, if residents find out they've been paying dues for repairs that never happened, the whole board could collapse. They'll protect themselves. At any cost." Her words lingered, colder than the threat I'd read on my phone minutes earlier. At any cost. I wanted to argue, to say she was exaggerating, but the fear in her eyes kept me silent. She had lived in this building longer than I had, seen more, endured more, and now she was here in my apartment with proof in her hands, risking the same thing I was. The weight of the decision pressed down harder. Do I use this? Do I expose them, knowing the risk would rise with every step? Or do I stay quiet, protect myself, and let the lie continue? Neither choice felt like winning. One meant swallowing injustice. The other meant opening the door to consequences I couldn't control. "I don't know if I can do this," I admitted. My voice cracked, the words spilling out raw and unpolished. "I thought I just wanted them to fix my car, to admit responsibility. But now it feels like something bigger, something I don't know if I'm ready for." Clara didn't answer right away. She pulled out a chair and sat across from me, folding her hands over the papers. When she finally spoke, her tone was softer. "None of us are ever ready. That's how they win. They make you doubt yourself until silence feels easier. But once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. That's the curse, or maybe the gift." Her words echoed long after she left that night, leaving me alone with the papers and the message still glowing on my phone. I sat there for hours, torn between fear and fury, until dawn started to creep through the blinds. That's when I knew. There was no going back. The next day, I called a meeting with a few neighbors I trusted. Not many, just 3 people who had already shared their own stories of damage ignored, of silence forced. We gathered in my living room, the air heavy with suspicion and a quiet kind of courage. I spread Clara's reports on the table, my fingers trembling as I pointed to the shutter's false inspection. Their faces changed one by one, from curiosity to anger to something more dangerous. Resolve. "This is bigger than a broken shutter," one of them said. "Bigger than a dented car," another added. Their voices fueled me but also scared me, because now it wasn't just my fight. If I went forward, they would too, and if things got worse, if the threats became real, I'd have dragged them with me. The guilt gnawed at me even as we agreed to draft a petition, to demand accountability, to confront the board in the open. That night, I finally hit send on the email to the board. Not just my complaint this time, but a warning. Residents were aware, documents existed, and silence would not last. My finger hovered for only a second before pressing down. The message flew out into the dark, irreversible. For the first time, I felt both lighter and heavier at once. Lighter, because the choice was made. Heavier, because I knew the storm was coming. The response came faster than I expected. The next evening, a notice appeared on every resident's door. Emergency board meeting, attendance mandatory. The language alone made my stomach twist. Mandatory. Emergency. It was clear this wasn't about repair or resolution. It was about control. When I walked into the meeting room, the tension was thick enough to taste. Rows of folding chairs filled with residents, all buzzing with unease. At the front, the board sat in a stiff line, their faces hard, eyes fixed on the crowd like judges waiting to deliver a sentence. The property manager stood beside them, shuffling, papers nervously. The envelope shook in my hand long after I'd read the single line inside. The words were so simple, but they carried the weight of something final. It wasn't just a threat anymore. It was a declaration. I sank into the chair. The same chair, where Clara had sat just nights ago, and stared at the paper until my eyes blurred. Part of me wanted to tear it into 100 pieces, to erase the message before it rooted itself deeper in my chest. But another part of me, the stubborn part, folded it carefully and placed it with the others. Evidence. A trail. Proof that silence had never been my choice. It had always been theirs to impose. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the building felt deliberate, like someone waiting in the hallway, someone watching. The air in the apartment grew thick, heavy with unease. At one point, I caught my reflection in the dark window, and for a moment, I barely recognized myself. The circles under my eyes, the tight line of my mouth, the way my shoulders hunched as if bracing for an unseen blow. This wasn't who I had been 2 months ago when I drove my new car home with a smile. That person felt distant now, swallowed by fear and anger. The next morning, Clara knocked on my door again. She looked tired, her face paler than usual. I let her in, and she went straight to the table, her hands trembling slightly as she placed another folder down. "They're coming after you harder than I thought," she whispered. "You need to be careful." Her warning should have comforted me, but something in her eyes made me pause. They didn't carry the same sharpness I'd seen before. Instead, there was hesitation, almost guilt. "What is it?" I asked, my voice low. She shook her head quickly, too quickly. "Nothing. Just, I've been here long enough to know how they work. They'll twist everything. You can't trust them." Her words were right, but the way she said them felt off, rehearsed, like a line repeated too many times. My stomach knotted. I wanted to ask her more, but before I could, she stood and left, muttering something about needing rest. The door closed. Behind her, leaving me with the uneasy feeling that something had shifted. That afternoon, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was calm, smooth. "I hear you've been making quite a noise," the man said. "This is not the kind of place where noise is welcome." I froze, gripping the phone tighter. "Who is this?" There was a short chuckle, the kind that made my skin crawl. "Let's just say I'm someone who knows the board very well. You should ask yourself something. How much do you really know about the people around you?" The line went dead. The words echoed in my head long after. How much do you really know about the people around you? It was a simple question, but it burrowed deep. I thought of Clara, of the neighbors who had sat in my living room, nodding with anger and resolve, of the board members who smiled in public but whispered in the lobby. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet didn't feel as steady. That night, I decided to double-check the reports Clara had given me. I spread them out on the table again, going line by line. At first, they looked the same, familiar scribbles, dates, signatures. But the more I stared, the more something bothered me. The handwriting. It was neat, almost too neat, as if someone had gone out of their way to make it clear. And then it hit me. The signatures didn't match. A few were slightly different, as though copied but not perfectly. A chill ran down my spine. Were these reports real? Or were they fabricated, designed to push me further into a fight I couldn't win? I needed answers. I took one of the reports. Downstairs, found the building's janitor in the maintenance room, and showed him the paperwork. He squinted, scratched his head, and shook it slowly. "I never saw this inspection happen," he said. "And that signature? That's not the maintenance company we use. Haven't been for years." My chest tightened. If the reports weren't authentic, then Clara had lied. The walk back to my apartment felt heavier with every step. My mind raced through every conversation we'd had, every warning she'd given me. Had she been helping me or feeding me just enough truth mixed with lies to steer me where she wanted? When I reached my door, Clara was waiting. She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You look pale," she said softly. "Something wrong?" I forced a nod, but my throat felt dry. "Nothing. Just tired." Her gaze lingered on me a moment too long, as if she was searching for something beneath my words. Then she stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You're not doubting me, are you?" The question pierced through me. She asked it like she already knew the answer. I swallowed hard, unable to reply. She leaned closer, her whisper sharp now. "If you're going to keep fighting, you'll need me. Don't forget that." The fire burned itself into my memory more than into the garage. Long after the flames were put out, I could still hear the crackle, still smell the smoke clinging to my clothes. My car, once the symbol of a new beginning, was nothing but charred. Metal and melted glass. Neighbors stood in clusters, whispering in low voices, their faces pale with a mixture of fear and curiosity. But I didn't hear them. All I heard was the pounding of my own heart, louder than the sirens fading into the distance. I knew this wasn't an accident. This was a message written in fire, meant for me. By the time I made it back to my apartment, the exhaustion finally set in. My body felt like lead, but my mind wouldn't stop. I thought of Clara, of her careful lies, of the board's threats. Every path circled back to the same truth. I had been caught between forces bigger and uglier than I realized. But now there was no turning back. They had taken my car. They had set fire to more than metal. They had burned away the last of my patience, the last of my restraint. The next morning, I went straight to the board's office. My hands shook as I pushed open the glass door, but my voice was steady when I spoke. "I want answers," I said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. The board members looked up, startled, then quickly composed themselves. Richard, the smug one who always wore that practiced smile, leaned back in his chair. Answers. About what? He said calmly, like he was inviting me to embarrass myself. You know what? I snapped. The threats, the notices, the fire, all of it. There was a pause, and then soft laughter. Careful with your words. Accusations like that can have consequences. Something inside me broke then. I slammed the folder of false reports Clara had given me onto the table. I know these are fake. I know you've been covering things up. I don't care how long it takes, but I will not stay quiet anymore. For a moment, the room was silent. The board members shifted uncomfortably, avoiding each other's eyes. And then Richard leaned forward, his smile gone. Do you really think anyone will believe you? You're just one resident. We're the board. We decide what people see, what they don't. You're nothing but noise. The words stung, but they also lit something inside me. Maybe, I said, my voice low. But sometimes noise is exactly what wakes people up. I walked out before he could answer, my pulse racing, my throat tight. I didn't know if I had won anything in that moment, but I had taken back something they couldn't control, my voice. When I reached the lobby, Clara was waiting. She looked different now, less polished, almost nervous. I heard what you did, she said softly. That was bold. Bold or stupid? I asked bitterly. She tilted her head, watching me carefully. Both, maybe, but sometimes that's what it takes. I wanted to push her away, to accuse her again of using me, of feeding me lies. But before I could, she surprised me. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small stack of papers, this time with photographs, receipts, real signatures. I didn't lie about everything, she whispered. I needed you angry enough to fight, but I couldn't give you the real proof. Until now. If I had, they'd know it came from me. I stared at the papers, my chest tight. The evidence was clear. Funds diverted, maintenance ignored, safety checks skipped. Real proof of negligence. For a moment, I didn't know whether to feel relief or fury. Clara had dragged me through hell to get me here, but she had also handed me the weapon I needed most. Why are you giving this to me now? I asked, my voice sharp. Her eyes glistened, and for once I saw no manipulation there, just raw truth. Because I can't fight them anymore. They already destroyed my reputation, my savings. But you still have something left. You can finish this. I took the papers slowly, my hands trembling. In that moment, I understood. Clara had been both my ally and my enemy, pushing me harder than I would have gone on my own. She had used me, yes, but maybe she had also believed in me. The contradiction cut deep. That night, I filed a formal report with the city inspector, attaching every piece of evidence. I didn't know how long it would take, or if it would even work, but it felt like the only way forward. When I hit send, a strange calm washed over me. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had done something more than react. I had chosen. But peace didn't last long. A knock came at my door around midnight. When I opened it, Richard was standing there, his smile gone, his eyes cold. You think you've won? He said quietly. This isn't over. People like you never win against people like us. For a moment, fear gripped me again. But then, I stepped closer, close enough to see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. Maybe I don't win, I whispered. But you've already lost, because now everyone's going to see what you've done. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He just turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hall. When I closed the door, I collapsed against it, my body shaking. That confrontation had cost me something. I could feel it, but it had also given me something I hadn't had before. Certainty. This was no longer about my car, or even about me. It was about standing against people who thought silence could bury truth. The following days blurred into one long storm of interviews, inspections, and whispered conversations. The inspector came, asked questions, took photos of the damage in the garage. Neighbors who had once stayed quiet began speaking up, sharing their own stories of neglect. Slowly, the board's perfect facade began to crack. And yet, as the walls closed in around them, I couldn't shake the feeling that something darker still waited beneath the surface. Clara had vanished, leaving only a short note under my door. I did what I could. Don't look for me. It haunted me. Had she fled out of fear? Or had she been part of something deeper all along? The climax came in a meeting held weeks later. The entire building had gathered, tension filling the air. The inspector laid out the findings: clear violations, undeniable negligence. Gasps echoed through the crowd as the truth was spoken aloud. For the first time, the board couldn't hide. Richard sat stiffly, his face pale, sweat beading at his temple. When the inspector finished, silence hung heavy. Then slowly, the residents began to clap. It wasn't loud at first, but it grew, filling the room with something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. I looked at Richard one last time, and for a moment our eyes locked. His expression wasn't anger. It was fear. Real fear. And in that instant, I knew I had broken something he thought unbreakable, but the victory was not pure. It carried shadows. My car was gone. Clara was gone. And even with the board exposed, I couldn't shake the question that gnawed at me. Had I won because of truth, or because I had been willing to let someone else's lies push me this far? As the meeting ended and people filed out, I stood alone, for a moment, staring at the empty chairs where the board had once sat so confidently. The battle was over, but something told me the war wasn't. And then I noticed it. A folded note slipped under my chair. My stomach dropped as I picked it. Up. 3 words, written in the same careful hand as before. This isn't finished. The room felt suddenly colder, the applause still echoing faintly down the hall. I slipped the note into my pocket, my heart heavy but steady. The conflict had exploded. The truth had been revealed, but the story wasn't done. A new shadow lingered, waiting, promising that even after fire and betrayal, there were still deeper battles ahead. The applause faded quickly, swallowed by the empty hallways as neighbors drifted back to their own lives. Their voices, once urgent with outrage, softened into the kind of chatter that fills space without carrying weight. I stood alone in the dim light, the note in my pocket pressing like a stone against my ribs. This isn't finished. The words lingered, heavier than the smoke that had once filled my lungs. I wondered if it ever really would be finished, or if battles like these only changed shape, never truly ending. The inspector's report had made everything clear. The board was exposed, stripped of the authority they had clung to like armor. But victory felt hollow, like biting into fruit and finding it sour inside. My car was gone. Clara was gone. And the people who had once whispered about me in judgment now whispered about me in admiration. But even their praise felt like a weight. It wasn't about them. It never had been. It was about the quiet nights I would never get back. The trust I would never fully hold again. I walked home slowly that evening, past the burned frame of the garage. The air still carried a faint trace of ash, clinging stubbornly to the brick walls. I stopped and placed my hand against the blackened steel, feeling its coldness seep into my skin. What was once mine had been reduced to wreckage, but in its ruins, I had found something else. Not triumph, not even peace, but a strange kind of clarity. Everything breaks, I thought. What matters is what survives the breaking. In the weeks that followed, the board dissolved one by one. Richard vanished from sight, leaving no forwarding address, no explanation. Some said he had fled to avoid lawsuits. Others whispered darker things. I stopped caring which was true. His absence was enough. The others who had stood beside him melted back into the city, quiet and unremarkable, once stripped of their titles. Without the board, the building felt strangely freer, though also emptier, like a stage after the actors have left. Neighbors approached me differently now. Some thanked me, their eyes bright with a gratitude that felt almost too heavy to hold. Others avoided me, their silence thicker than before. Maybe they saw me as a reminder of something they'd rather forget, that silence can make you complicit, that looking away has its own price. Either way, I carried their stares without flinching. I had carried worse. Clara remained a ghost. Her note, "Don't look for me," stayed on my desk, its edges curling from the weight of time. Some nights I stared at it until dawn crept through the blinds, wondering if she had meant it as a warning or a plea. Maybe both. She had given me the tools I needed, but at a cost neither of us could name aloud. I hated her for her lies. I missed her for her truth. And I couldn't decide which weighed more. The insurance company eventually wrote me a check for the car. The number on the paper was large, but it didn't feel like compensation. Money couldn't scrub the sight of flames against the night sky, or the sound of my own heartbeat when Richard stood at my door, promising that people like me never win. The check bought me another car, white like the first, but driving it felt different. The engine hummed, smooth and steady, but it carried a shadow the old one never had. I drove slower now, not because I feared accidents, but because I understood too well how quickly stability burns. Time softened some of the edges, but it never erased them. The building still bore scars, cracked walls, patched roofs, spaces, where trust had been stripped away. And I bore mine too, though less visible. My voice carried differently when I spoke. My patience thinned faster, my eyes scanned longer. I had learned that power thrives in silence, and silence was something I no longer knew how to keep. One evening, months later, I returned to the garage site. Grass had begun to grow in patches where fire once raged, small green shoots pushing through the blackened soil. I crouched down, brushing my fingers against them, fragile but alive. I wondered if that was what survival really meant, not erasing what had been lost, but finding ways to grow inside the ruins. The note still lived. In my pocket, creased and faded. Sometimes I thought about throwing it away, letting its threat dissolve into nothing, but I couldn't. It was a reminder of the cost, yes, but also of the truth, that stories like this don't end neatly. They leave shadows, whispers, questions, and maybe that was the point, to carry them, not to erase them. As the sun set, the garage glowed in the amber light, no longer menacing, no longer broken, just a piece of the landscape. I stood there, listening to the quiet hum of the city beyond, the faint laughter of children in the distance, the rustle of leaves in the wind. Life had gone on, indifferent and unstoppable. I closed my eyes and let the silence settle. Not heavy, this time, but almost tender. Everything that had been taken from me, everything I had fought for, everything I had lost, it all led to this moment of stillness. A scar is not an ending. It's a reminder. When I finally opened my eyes, I slipped. The note from my pocket, held it once more, then folded it back carefully and tucked it away. Not to keep the fear, but to keep the truth. And as I walked away, leaving the garage and its ghosts behind, I felt the weight of everything that had happened settle into place. Not gone, not fixed, but part of me now, the way ash becomes part of the soil. Somewhere deep in my chest, beneath the ache, a thought formed as clear as the evening sky. Even in ruins, something always survives. That was enough.